Hi, my name is Rachel.
And I'm Ashley.
And this is our Biblical Integration Digital Interview Project. So the question we'll be answering is, how will you integrate a biblical worldview into your content area classrooms in terms of teacher-learner relationships, classroom management, and behavioral issues, and creation and implementation of lessons in your area of study? So Ashley, in regards to teacher-learner relationships, what do you think?
The teacher-learner relationship in a classroom is very important because there does need to be a relationship between the teacher and student that includes trust, respect, and communication. A Bible verse that relates to that is going to be Genesis 1:27, which says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them." And this is really important because it defines humanity in general. It shows us that there is inherent value in every single person. And I think it's important, especially for teachers, to realize that about their students. It's important for us to realize that they are unique, that they have different interests, different passions, and to realize that they are people created in God's image. And it's also important to realize that there are boundaries, professional boundaries. As a teacher, there do need to be boundaries in the way that you deal with your students. While still communicating that you do believe in them and their worth. And so with teaching English as a second language, I'm going to personally make an effort to really get to know my students and to make sure that they know that their lives and their backgrounds matter to me. I'm going to ask them cultural questions and make sure that I know kind of where their heart is, where their passions lie, their reasons for learning English, their likes and dislikes. And so what about you? What do you think about the teacher-student relationship?
Well, much like what you said about having boundaries, and it's important to maintain that in a teacher-learner relationship, and also the fact that we have been coming to school and studying to be a teacher. Mm-hmm. We've been studying our content to be able to teach this to our students. And so one of the verses that stuck out to me was 1 Corinthians 15:58, which says, "Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain." So I think in the aspect of us as teachers, we need to have diligence in teaching our students and lesson planning, in evaluating their homework and evaluating them as students, and just being diligent in that aspect. But also as a TESOL major and teaching English in the future to my students, I think it's important for our students to learn diligence, because they need to know that to learn a language, in order to learn that, they do need to be diligent in studying it and communicating in that language and doing sorts of things like that.
Mm-hmm. Very cool.
And so for classroom management, that's our next section. So how would you integrate a biblical worldview into classroom management?
Classroom management is incredibly important because, like I said earlier, you do need to have those boundaries. And I think respect is key in understanding classroom management, because with chaos comes the idea that there's a lack of respect between students, between the teacher and students. And I personally am a big believer in collaboration. And especially for ESL, it's very helpful for ESL students to work in partners, to work in groups, to be able to have that sort of community, which also does provide for a noisier work environment because they are going to be working together and things like that. So therefore, I would try and have a system. I think it is important to establish rules in the beginning of the classroom to really show students what is expected of them, so that they're aware of the expectations, and so to have certain phrases, certain signals for classroom management for, to quiet down. English phrases in general, I think, are great to implement just so that they can hear that and then be able to respond by understanding. And so a verse that deals with that is Ephesians 4:2, which says, "Be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one another in love." And I think that applies because if we do work together and are careful about managing our classroom in a way that really promotes respect, I think that does take into consideration the idea that we should love each other and we should respect each other enough to be able to communicate in a positive way with each other. And so how would you respond with classroom management?
I really loved all your ideas. They sounded really good. One thing that I thought about as I answered this question is that obviously classroom management is a huge part of teaching. We have to maintain the classroom so that we can give them an environment to safely learn and to be willing to learn.
Yeah.
I think one of the coolest parts about being an English or an ESL teacher is that we're going to have conversation in our classroom. We're going to be able to have our students speak with each other, with us, to simply practice English. But one really important thing about having conversation, about managing the classroom and the conversation, is that we need to make sure it's wholesome talk. We don't want bullying to happen or kids saying mean things to each other. And so as a teacher, we need to make sure like we're walking around and checking, and also like in that checking their pronunciation and things like that we do in an ESL classroom. And one verse that really stuck out to me was Psalm 19:14, which says, "May these words of my mouth and this meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, Lord, my rock and redeemer." And this verse, I think it more applies to us as teachers, because though we may not be placed, or once we start working like in a Christian setting, it's important that we, in our words, we show God's love and his care for us, and that even like I mentioned before, in being diligent and in just making sure that our talk to the students is wholesome and among our colleagues as teachers when we're at school, and also just making sure the students are having good conversations. And finally, our last section is about lesson planning and how we can implement a biblical worldview into that. So Ashley, what did you say?
Yeah, so the lesson that I chose to work with for this idea is the family unit, which is a very common, popular theme in language learning settings. English, learning about the different family members, different words that we can use to describe our family members, things like that. And there are going to be different parameters based on if I'm working in a public or a private school, just legally, things like that. And so I think one of the biggest things is really being inclusive about the type of family environments that we talk about. For example, if I have a student that lives with their grandparents or a single family home, to mention families like that. And then in addition, the idea of adoption, because that is a very biblical idea. And Galatians 4:5b through 6 says, "Because you are his sons, God sent the spirit of his son into our hearts, the spirit who calls out, Abba, Father." And this really just shows our adoption into the kingdom of God, which is a great idea to communicate, and that would definitely have to be more subtle in a public school setting. But in a private school setting, I think it would be a great connection to make adoption in terms of your physical earthly family, and then in addition to your heavenly family. So I think it is important to be inclusive with family units and also be able to integrate that biblical concept of adoption. And so what do you think in regards to lesson planning?
Well, I think one of the things that is really awesome, once again, about being an ESL teacher, is that a lot of our lessons are based on building their vocabulary and making sure they know the language, whether that be English or Spanish or some other language they're learning. A big thing is building their vocabulary. So we can plan literally any lesson and be teaching them English.
Yeah.
So the lesson that I focused on for this particular segment is literally if we just did a lesson about jobs, about future occupations, where students learn the name of jobs and they learn how to ask where like another person is working or tell us another person where they work. And so learning about jobs in general and building their vocabulary. But then at the same time, if we held like a discussion and talked about jobs and talked about maybe what their parents do, or what they want to do in the future, their future aspirations and stuff like that. But it's also important to integrate into that like the concept of honesty, that when they grow older, when they are in their jobs, or even as students, that they can't be dishonest in their job.
Right.
And the verse that came to mind was Romans 13:7, and it says, "Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor." So that works in this activity about jobs in the future, about them being respectful of their bosses, about them honoring their word, about them not lying, and just being a respectable person in general, as well as students, in honoring those who are above them and being respectful. So just really integrating a biblical worldview into whatever lesson it is we end up talking about. Thank you.